She walked into the room completely soaked, her hair dripping, clothes clinging to her trembling body, and in that moment, everything changed. But what started as an awkward job interview would soon become a dangerous entanglement of trust, betrayal, and buried secrets, one that neither of them saw coming. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. So make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this? The rain was relentless that afternoon. Heavy drops pounded against the towering iron gates of the Ferrer estate, each crash echoing like a warning to anyone daring enough to approach. The driveway stretched long, lined with black, glistening cobblestones and guarded by statues that seemed to watch every movement. A figure moved slowly against the storm, a woman, her frame hunched beneath the weight of the rain. Her shoes squelched in the puddles, each step heavier than the last. By the time she reached the massive oak doors, her coat clung to her like a second skin, and her knuckles were white from gripping a worn leather folder to her chest. Inside, the world was another universe entirely. Warm, muted lights glowed over Persian rugs, the faint scent of cedarwood and old money lingering in the air. The sudden silence after the roar of the rain made her pulse thunder in her ears. Somewhere deeper in the house, a low voice was speaking, sharp, controlled, and irritated. "Send her in," the voice commanded. The butler, tall, expressionless, gave her a quick, disapproving glance before pushing open the double doors to a study that looked more like a private sanctuary. Dark mahogany shelves climbed to the ceiling, lined with books and secrets. A fire flickered low in the hearth, but it did little to soften the presence of the man seated behind the desk. He didn't look up at first. His pen scratched against paper with the precision of someone who valued every second of his time. When his eyes finally lifted, they were cold and assessing, pausing just long enough to take in the rainwater dripping from her hair onto the expensive carpet. "You're late," he said flatly. The woman swallowed hard. The bus, it broke down and I don't want excuses." His voice cut like a blade, making her flinch. "If you can't be on time for an interview, why would I trust you to manage anything else?" Her fingers tightened around the folder. The humiliation burned, but she didn't move. She couldn't. There was more than a job at stake here, though he couldn't possibly know that. For a brief moment, something flickered in his gaze, curiosity, maybe, or the faintest recognition of the defiance in her eyes. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Sit," he ordered, leaning back in his chair. "You have 5 minutes to convince me you're worth my time." As she lowered herself into the chair, the firelight caught the edge of her face, and for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowed. There was something familiar about her. But before he could place it, the grandfather clock in the corner struck the hour, and the sound seemed to pull them both into a tension neither understood yet. Outside, the rain grew heavier. Inside, the air between them became suffocating. And then she opened the folder. The folder rested on the polished desk like an unspoken dare. Her hands, still trembling from the cold, slid the clasp open, revealing a stack of neatly arranged documents. Her voice, when she spoke, was low but steady, the kind of steadiness that comes only when someone has no other choice but to push forward. "These are my credentials, my references, and examples of my previous work," she said, her eyes locking on his for a split second before flicking away. He didn't reach for the papers immediately. Instead, Alejandro leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp and unyielding, as though he could extract the truth just by staring long enough. The silence between them stretched, and the crackling fire became the only sound in the room. Finally, with deliberate slowness, he picked up the first page. His eyes scanned the text with mechanical precision until they stopped. He lifted his head, his brow barely furrowing, but his tone was different now, edged with suspicion. "You work for the Ortega Group?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, a slight hesitation in her voice. "For almost 2 years." He tapped the paper once with his finger. "That company went bankrupt after a very public scandal. And you left just weeks before it happened." Her lips parted, but no words came out. The truth was tangled, messy, the kind of truth you didn't unpack in a 5-minute interview. "Coincidence?" he pressed. Her throat tightened. "I had my reasons for leaving." The way she said it made something in his chest stir. He recognized that tone, a tone he himself had used when burying pieces of the past he wished no one would dig up. But Alejandro wasn't in the business of trusting easily, especially not strangers who showed up late, soaked to the bone, and already carrying secrets. Reasons, he repeated softly, almost to himself, before setting the page down. Do you understand the nature of this position? She nodded. I do. Personal assistant. Scheduling. Managing calls. Handling confidential matters. And when I say confidential, I mean more than simply keeping files locked, he said, his voice dropping an octave. I mean loyalty so absolute, you'd be willing to take things to the grave. Can you do that? Her pulse quickened. Yes. It wasn't the yes of someone desperate for a paycheck. It was sharper, more weighted. And Alejandro heard it. He rose from his chair, moving toward the tall windows. Rain smeared the glass in frantic patterns, the storm outside matching the current that had begun to build inside the room. His reflection in the glass was a man composed, controlled, but his mind was moving in ways he didn't like. There was something about her, something he couldn't place, that made his instincts itch. The last time he ignored that feeling, it had cost him dearly. Stand up, he said suddenly. She blinked. What? I want to see how you carry yourself, he replied, turning to face her fully. His eyes traveled from her damp hair down to the muddy hem of her skirt. She straightened instinctively, her chin lifting ever so slightly, like someone who'd learned long ago that lowering it was an invitation for others to step on you. He almost smiled. Almost. Walk, he instructed. She obeyed, moving across the rug toward the far side of the room. The sound of her wet shoes muffled against the Persian weave. When she turned, their eyes met again, and this time, neither looked away. It was in that brief, unbroken gaze that Alejandro realized she wasn't here by accident. Before he could speak, the phone on his desk rang, a sharp, jarring sound that broke the moment. He answered, his tone clipped. Yes. The voice on the other end was urgent, low, and whatever it said made his expression darken instantly. I'll be right there, he said before hanging up. He turned to her. Wait here. Do not touch anything. And then he was gone, the heavy doors closing behind him with a muted thud. She stood in the middle of the study, the fire casting long shadows that seemed to lean in around her. Her fingers itched toward the documents on the desk. Not to take them back, but to do something else entirely. Something she'd promised herself she wouldn't do unless she had no other choice. Outside, the rain masked the sound of footsteps returning down the hall. But it wasn't Alejandro. It was someone else, and they were coming straight for her. The handle of the heavy study doors turned slowly, the brass groaning under a deliberate grip. Valeria's breath caught in her throat. She had been standing still, like a statue in the warm flicker of the fireplace, but now every muscle in her body tensed. The doors eased open, and a figure slipped inside. It wasn't Alejandro. A tall man in a perfectly pressed gray suit stepped in, closing the door behind him with the kind of care that told her he didn't want anyone to hear he'd entered. His shoes barely made a sound against the thick carpet. His hair was slicked back, his jaw sharp, his eyes calculated. You're her, he said, as though confirming something to himself. Valeria's fingers gripped the strap of her bag. I'm here for an interview. The corner of his mouth twitched, not a smile, more like someone suppressing one. He walked toward the desk with unhurried steps, his gaze sliding over the open folder of her credentials. Without asking, he picked up the top page, scanning it like he had every right to. You shouldn't be here, he said softly, his eyes still on the paper. The words made the hairs on the back of her neck rise. I was invited. He finally looked at her, and for a heartbeat, there was something in his expression. Pity? No, warning. Not by me. She swallowed hard. Who are you? He didn't answer. Instead, he set the paper down, his fingers tapping lightly against the mahogany surface. Does Alejandro know? Know what? That seemed to amuse him. He stepped around the desk, closing the distance between them. The scent of his cologne, expensive, controlled, reached her before he did. I suppose not. He would have thrown you out already. Valeria's mind scrambled for something to say, but nothing would land without giving too much away. Whatever you think you're doing, he continued, stop. This place is not safe for someone like you. His voice carried a weight that was almost convincing. Almost. I can take care of myself, she said, forcing her voice to steady. For the first time, he smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I don't doubt that. I doubt you'll get the chance. Before she could ask him what he meant, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the hall, heavier this time, purposeful. The man straightened, gave her one last unreadable look, and slipped toward the side door hidden between two towering bookshelves. Without a sound, he was gone. The main door swung open. Alejandro strode in, his dark eyes narrowing immediately. Were you alone? Yes, she lied without thinking. His gaze lingered on her, as if testing the truth in her answer. He didn't press it, but his hand rested on the back of his chair, his knuckles tightening ever so slightly. Change of plans, he said curtly. If you want this position, your interview isn't going to be in here. Her brows knit together. Where then? He stepped toward the door, holding it open. Follow me. The hallway beyond the study was dim, lined with framed oil paintings that seemed to watch her as they walked. The air smelled faintly of polish and rain-soaked stone. They moved past closed doors, each one heavy enough to keep its secrets locked away. She caught glimpses, a grand dining room with a table long enough to seat 20, a gallery of antique clocks all ticking out of sync, a glass conservatory fog with condensation. Finally, they reached another set of doors, double and carved with intricate patterns. Alejandro pushed them open, revealing a room so different it stole her breath for a moment. It was a library, but unlike the cold precision of his study, this space was alive. Floor-to-ceiling windows let in what little gray light the storm offered. The walls were lined with shelves that bowed under the weight of hundreds of books, the scent of paper and leather filling the air. In the center, a long wooden table was scattered with documents, blueprints, and an open laptop. This, Alejandro said, stepping inside, is where I decide who I can trust. Her pulse jumped. With what? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the table and picked up a small black envelope. He turned it over in his hand before tossing it onto the wood in front of her. Open it, he said. She hesitated, then slid a finger under the flap. Inside was a photograph, grainy, taken from a distance, of Alejandro himself, standing on a street she didn't recognize, talking to someone whose face had been deliberately blurred. Her eyes lifted to his. What is this? That, he said slowly, is why I need someone I can trust and why I'm not sure you're the one. The storm outside thundered, the windows rattling with the force of it. And for the first time since she'd stepped into the Ferrer estate, Valeria realized she might be walking straight into the middle of something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The photograph felt heavier than paper should. Valeria held it between her fingers, studying the blurred figure next to Alejandro, the distorted pixels giving away nothing yet, somehow, speaking volumes. She could feel Alejandro's eyes on her, gauging every flicker of emotion that crossed her face. I'm not in the habit of explaining myself to strangers, he began, his voice calm but laced with a gravity that seemed to thicken the air. But if you want this position, you need to understand that working for me means being dragged into matters that have consequences far beyond this house. And those consequences can be lethal. Her heartbeat quickened. Lethal. The word lodged itself in her mind like a splinter. Is this some kind of intimidation tactic? She asked, keeping her voice steady despite the churn in her stomach. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something sharper. If I wanted to intimidate you, miss Valeria, was it? You'd already be walking back out into the rain. Her grip on the photograph tightened. Then what do you want from me? He didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned and began pacing along the far side of the table, his gaze sweeping over the papers and blueprints as if searching for something. Before I decide if I can trust you, I need to see what you do when you're under pressure. When the stakes aren't just about a salary, but about your survival. The word survival caught in her ears like the chime of a clock in a silent room. She glanced back down at the photograph, noticing now, in the bottom right corner, a faint timestamp. A date. 3 weeks ago. Before she could form the question in her mind, the sound of the double doors creaking open pulled her attention. Alejandro's jaw tightened as a figure stepped into the room, the same man from before, the one who had warned her. He was carrying a slim black case in one hand, his other slipping into his pocket like he owned the space. I told you to wait downstairs, Alejandro said without looking at him. The man smirked. "And I told you this couldn't wait." His eyes flicked toward Valeria, and for a brief second, his expression softened, though it felt more like the softness of a predator circling prey. "I see you've met our candidate." "Get to the point, Marcos," Alejandro replied, his patience thinning. Marcos set the case on the table, clicking it open to reveal neatly arranged compartments. Inside, there were small devices, wires, and a sleek silver pen resting on a velvet lining. But the pen wasn't just a pen. Valeria recognized the discreet lens embedded near the clip. Alejandro's gaze cut to her, sharp. "Do you know what that is?" She hesitated, then nodded. "A recording device." Marcos chuckled lowly. "Smart girl." Alejandro ignored him. "Someone's been using devices like this to follow me, photograph me, track my movements. That picture I gave you, it was taken with one of these." The room felt colder now, despite the warmth from the storm-muted sunlight. Valeria's mind spun. She shouldn't care. This wasn't her world, her problem, but something in Alejandro's tone, in the undercurrent of his words, told her that leaving now would be impossible. Marcos picked up the pen, twirling it between his fingers before setting it down in front of her. "Consider this your first test," he said. "Find out who's behind it, or walk away before you've even started." Valeria's eyes shifted between them. "And if I don't?" Alejandro's voice was quiet, but it carried a finality that left no room for negotiation. "Then you'll have wasted both our time, and that's something I never forgive." The storm outside roared, the windows trembling against the wind. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then Marcos stepped back, gesturing toward the library doors. "You have until tomorrow," he said. "After that, your name goes on a list you don't want to be on." Valeria's pulse was loud in her ears. She'd come here for a job. Now she was being thrown into a hunt she didn't understand, in a house full of locked rooms and even more locked faces. And as she turned to leave, the photograph still burning in her pocket, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just been pulled into a game that had already claimed more than one life. What she didn't know, what neither man said, was that her name had already been mentioned in connection to that blurred figure in the photo. And someone, somewhere in the house, had just been told she was here. The library door shut behind her with a muted thud, sealing Alejandro and Marcos inside. The echo followed Valeria down the hallway like a reminder she wasn't supposed to be here, at least not in the way she thought when she arrived. Her shoes left faint damp marks on the gleaming wooden floor, a silent trail that would fade within minutes, but felt, to her, like evidence. She should have walked straight to the front doors, thanked them for their time, and disappeared into the rain. That would have been the smart thing. But she wasn't here for smart. She was here for a reason that had nothing to do with employment and everything to do with answers. Her steps slowed as she passed a tall, arched window. Through the blurred veil of rain, the garden stretched out, manicured lawns, winding stone paths, hedges trimmed to unnatural perfection. In the center stood a white gazebo, its paint chipped in places, the roof sagging slightly under the weight of water. She didn't know why her eyes locked on it, but something about it felt wrong. A faint noise pulled her back. Soft footsteps. She moved quickly, slipping into the shadowed alcove between two heavy curtains just as someone rounded the corner. It was the butler, the same one who had greeted her with that disapproving look earlier. He carried a silver tray with a single cup of coffee, steam curling above it. His pace was brisk, but his eyes flicked to each closed door as he passed, scanning them with the wariness of someone guarding more than rooms. When he was gone, Valeria exhaled, easing out of the alcove. She continued deeper into the mansion, her mind working through the pieces. Alejandro's warning, Marcos's threat, the photograph, the device. And the part no one had mentioned, that blurred figure in the picture. She knew them. Not well, but enough to feel the knot in her stomach tighten. She turned down another corridor, this one dimmer, the walls lined with paintings of the Farrer family. Generations stared down at her, their eyes following as she walked. She stopped at the last portrait, a woman in a flowing emerald gown, her beauty severe, her hands resting on the shoulders of a young boy. The plaque beneath read Beatrice Farrer, 1989. The boy's face was unmistakable. Alejandro. But it was the background of the painting that made her lean closer. Through the painted windows, there it was again, the white gazebo. and behind it, half hidden in shadow, a figure. Unfinished, as if the artist had intended to erase them but stopped halfway. Looking for something? The voice was close, almost behind her ear. Valeria spun, her pulse spiking. Marcos leaned casually against the wall, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You move quietly," she said, masking her surprise. He shrugged. "Old houses teach you to step lightly. So, why aren't you waiting where Alejandro told you to?" "I was exploring," she said, forcing calm in her tone. "You said I have until tomorrow. That means I need to start now." His smile was faint, but his eyes didn't soften. "Starting in this hallway?" She stepped closer to the painting. "I noticed something." Marcos followed her gaze, his brow lifting slightly when he saw the gazebo. "That? Yes. It's in the gardens. I saw it from the window earlier. And here, in the painting, there's someone behind it." "Who is it?" Marcos didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head, studying her, as though trying to decide how much she deserved to know. "That painting's been here longer than I have," he said finally. "Some say the artist hid messages in it. Others say it's just a trick of the brush." "Which do you believe?" she asked. "I believe," he said slowly, "that curiosity is dangerous here, especially for someone who hasn't even been hired yet." He stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "If you're smart, Valeria, you'll stay away from the gazebo." Her breath caught at the sound of her name. She hadn't told him it. Before she could respond, Alejandro's voice rang out from the far end of the corridor. "Marcos!" The man straightened, his gaze lingering on her for a beat longer before he turned and walked toward the sound, his footsteps echoing off the marble. Valeria remained by the portrait, her mind racing. She had come for answers, and now she had more questions than ever. The photograph, the gazebo, the figure in the painting. She glanced once more at the shadowed shape behind the gazebo in the artwork. And this time, she realized why it had unsettled her. The outline, vague, blurred, matched the build of the person in the photograph. The rain had eased into a steady drizzle by the time Valeria slipped out a side door of the mansion, the hood of her coat pulled low over her face. The air outside was colder than she'd expected, sharp enough to cut through the damp fabric clinging to her skin. She glanced around. The garden stretched silent and empty, the manicured hedges swaying faintly in the wind. Somewhere above, a raven croaked, the sound jagged against the muted patter of rain. Her eyes found the gazebo immediately. Even from here, across the glistening lawn, it seemed out of place. The rest of the estate was pristine, maintained to perfection, but the gazebo stood weathered, its white paint peeling in long strips, wood darkened by years of rain and sun. The roof sagged slightly in the center, like it carried a weight it had no business bearing. She stepped off the stone path, her shoes sinking slightly into the wet grass. With each step toward the gazebo, the air seemed to change, heavier, quieter, as if the rain itself grew more careful about falling here. Halfway there, she froze. Footsteps. They were faint, muffled by the grass, but definitely coming from somewhere behind her. She turned, scanning the gray expanse of garden. Nothing, just the distant shape of the mansion, its windows glinting with muted light. Her breath fogged in the air as she continued forward, reaching the gazebo steps. They creaked under her weight, though it felt soft in places, rotting from years of neglect. She brushed a hand along one of the pillars. Her fingers caught on a thin groove carved into the paint. She leaned closer. It wasn't random damage. It was a date. October 12th, 04. The numbers were small, nearly invisible unless you were looking for them. The moment she read them, a flicker of memory stirred. A news headline from years ago, about an incident on the Fair estate. Details had been scarce, the police statements vague, but she remembered the date. It was the same. She crouched, scanning the floorboards. One of them was slightly raised along the edge, as if it had been pried open before. She slid her fingers under it and felt it give way with a faint crack. Inside, there was a narrow compartment, dark and dry despite the years. Her fingertips brushed against something cold. Metal. Before she could pull it out, a voice cut through the damp air. "I told you to stay away from here." She spun. Marco stood at the edge of the gazebo steps, his suit jacket unbuttoned, rain clinging to the sharp line of his shoulders. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, Those were dark with something between warning and threat. "What is this place?" she demanded, still crouched over the open board. "You don't want to know," he said flatly. She straightened, the object still hidden in her hand. "You think telling me that is going to make me stop?" His jaw tightened. "I think if you're smart, you'll walk back to the house and pretend you never saw this." Valeria stepped forward, closing the gap between them by one pace. "I'm not here to be smart. I'm here because someone in this place owes me the truth." For the first time, something shifted in his face, the faintest crack in that calm mask. He glanced at her hand, still curled around the hidden object. "Give it to me," he said. Her grip tightened. "Why?" "Because," he said slowly, "if you keep it, you're going to find yourself in the same kind of trouble the person who hid it was in. And trust me, it didn't make it out." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of wet earth and something older, something metallic. The rain began to fall harder again, drumming against the gazebo roof. Behind Marcos, across the lawn, a tall figure appeared in the mist, Alejandro. His pace was quick, his expression unreadable from this distance, but his eyes were locked on them. Marcos didn't look away from Valeria. "Last chance," he murmured. "Hand it over before he gets here." Her pulse thundered in her ears. She glanced down at her hand, at the faint glint of the metal sheet pulled from the floor. It wasn't just metal. It was a small, tarnished key. Alejandro's silhouette grew sharper with every step across the rain-soaked lawn. His dark coat flared with the wind, and droplets clung to his hair, but his stride was steady, purposeful, the kind of stride that made you feel like running even if you'd done nothing wrong. Marcos didn't move from the base of the gazebo steps. He stood there like a blockade, the rain streaming down the angles of his face. His voice was low, urgent. "Valeria, listen to me. Whatever you think you're going to get out of this, it's not worth it." Her fingers curled tighter around the key, the cold metal biting into her palm. "That's not for you to decide." Marcos's eyes flicked toward Alejandro's approaching figure. "You have no idea what that unlocks. You don't even know whose blood is on it." The words sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the weather. Alejandro was close enough now to call out. His voice cut through the rain. "Step aside, Marcos." Marcos didn't budge. "She doesn't need to be involved in this." She involved herself the moment she started prying into things that weren't hers. Alejandro replied, his tone like steel. He ascended the steps, his gaze never leaving Valeria. She held her ground, though every instinct told her to back away. Alejandro stopped only a foot from her, the storm-dark smell of rain and cedar clinging to him. His eyes dropped to her hand. "Open it," he said. Her throat tightened. "No." For a moment, the world seemed to still. No rain, no wind, just the weight of his stare pressing against her. Then he reached forward and, with surprising gentleness, took her wrist. The contrast was jarring. His grip firm but not bruising, his thumb brushing against the wet skin of her hand, as if trying to read her through touch. "Valeria," he said, his voice quieter now, "show me what you've taken." She hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't trust Marcos, but she didn't trust Alejandro either, not fully. Yet something in the way he said her name, it wasn't a threat. It was something closer to a plea. Before she could decide, Marcos stepped in, his tone sharp. "Don't give it to him. You know what he'll do with it." Alejandro's head turned slowly toward him. "And what exactly do you think I'll do, Marcos?" "Bury it, like you bury everything else." The air between them thickened. Valeria's eyes darted from one to the other, realizing she was standing between two men who weren't just colleagues. There was history here, the kind that left scars you couldn't see. Alejandro released her wrist, but his eyes stayed locked on hers. "If you want the job," he said, "you'll hand me that key. If you want to walk away, keep it, and I won't stop you. But you won't get a second chance." Marcos stepped closer to her side, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "If you give it to him, you'll never know the truth about what happened in this garden." Her chest tightened. She could feel the decision hanging in the air, as heavy as the storm clouds above. Slowly, she opened her palm, revealing the tarnished key glistening with raindrops. Both men's eyes locked on it. Neither moved. Finally, she closed her fist around it again. "I'm keeping it." Marcos's mouth twitched, a flicker of approval. Alejandro's jaw tightened, But instead of taking it from her, he stepped back. Then you'd better be ready for what comes next. Thunder rolled overhead, loud enough to shake the gazebo's frail frame. Alejandro turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the curtain of rain. Marcos lingered a moment longer, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Be careful," he said. "You just declared yourself a player in a game you don't understand." And then he, too, was gone. Valeria stood alone in the gazebo, the key burning cold in her hand. She glanced once more at the carved date on the pillar. October 12th, 04. She needed to know what happened that day, and why this key had been hidden here for years. But as she stepped down into the wet grass, a movement in the corner of her vision made her pause. At one of the upper windows of the mansion, a curtain had been pulled back slightly. Someone was watching her. The image of that slightly parted curtain stayed with her all the way back to the mansion. Even as the storm beat down harder, soaking her again, she could still picture the silhouette behind the glass, still, unmoving, deliberately watching. Whoever it was hadn't stepped back when she looked up. They wanted her to see them. The butler was waiting just inside the side entrance when she returned, his eyes flicking immediately to her damp hair and muddy shoes. "Senor Ferrer asked that you remain in the east wing for the rest of the evening," he said, his tone perfectly polite but edged with something colder. "Dinner will be served at 7. Until then, I suggest you rest." It wasn't a suggestion. Valeria nodded, offering no argument, and let him lead her to a guest room on the second floor. The space was beautiful in a way that made her feel like an intruder. Tall ceilings, a canopy bed draped in heavy curtains, a fireplace set in marble, and a single window overlooking the gardens. The gazebo just visible through the sheets of rain. The door shut behind her with a soft click. She waited, listening for the sound of retreating footsteps. When the hallway fell silent, she crossed to the window, scanning the lawn for movement. Nothing. The gazebo stood as still as a painting. But the upper floor window, where she'd seen the watcher earlier, that was in the north wing. And she wasn't in the north wing. She checked the time. Almost 6. Dinner was an hour away. If she moved quickly, she could slip out, find that room, and be back before anyone noticed. The decision was almost instinctive. She pulled her damp coat off, tossed it over the back of a chair, and stepped into the hallway, closing the door softly behind her. The mansion's corridors at this hour were different, quieter, heavier, as though the walls themselves absorbed sound. She passed 2 locked doors before finding the narrow side passage that curved toward the north wing. The floor here shifted from polished wood to thick, faded carpet. Fewer paintings hung on the walls. Instead, there were tall cabinets with glass fronts, filled with artifacts, porcelain figures, antique clocks, framed letters written in looping Spanish script. At the far end of the hallway, a sharp turn revealed a door unlike the others. It was heavier, darker, and the doorknob had been replaced with a small brass keyhole. Valeria's breath caught. She pulled the tarnished key from her pocket, her fingers damp with sweat despite the chill. The metal slid into the lock with a perfect fit. A slow twist, and she felt the subtle click. The door creaked open into darkness. She stepped inside, closing it gently behind her. The room smelled of dust and something faintly metallic, like coins or old blood. Heavy curtains covered the windows, letting in only the thinnest threads of gray light. As her eyes adjusted, she saw that the walls were lined with shelves, but instead of books, they held boxes. Dozens of them, each labeled with dates. Her pulse picked up. She moved toward the nearest shelf, her fingers brushing over the labels. Most were recent, within the last decade, but one box near the bottom stopped her cold. October 12th, 04. She crouched, pulling out carefully. The cardboard was soft with age, the edges fraying. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, was a stack of photographs, a silver locket, and a manila envelope sealed with black wax. The photographs were old, most of them blurry, taken at night. People in formal clothing, standing near the gazebo. One photo made her freeze. A young Alejandro, maybe 17, standing with a woman whose face was turned away from the camera. The next photograph made her hands go cold. It was the same scene as the first, but in this one, the woman's face was visible. And Valeria knew it instantly. It was her mother. Her knees nearly buckled, But before she could process what she was seeing, a sound behind her made her spin. The door was no longer closed. In the shadow of the doorway stood the butler, his tall frame blocking the hall light. His expression was calm, but his eyes, they were sharp, calculating. "You shouldn't be in here," he said quietly. Her mouth was dry. "You knew about this?" He stepped inside, shutting the door with a deliberate click. "I know everything that happens in this house." Her fingers tightened around the photograph of her mother. "Then tell me what happened that night." The butler's lips curved in something between a smirk and a warning. "That night," he said, "is the reason the Ferrer family doesn't bury their dead in the cemetery." Before she could ask what that meant, he stepped closer. "And if you value your life, you'll put everything back exactly where you found it. Lock this door and forget you were ever here." A floorboard creaked outside. Someone else was in the hallway. The butler's eyes flicked toward the noise, then back to her. "Now," he whispered, "before they see you." The sound of footsteps outside grew sharper, more defined. Not the slow, measured pace of servant, but heavier, confident strides that made the air in the room feel smaller. The butler's jaw tensed. He stepped toward Valeria, his voice a low hiss. "Give me the photograph." Now. Her grip on the image of her mother tightened until her knuckles whitened. "No." His eyes hardened. "You don't understand." But before he could finish, the doorknob turned. There was no time to think. Valeria slipped the photograph inside her blouse, the edge of the paper cold against her skin. She shoved the box back onto the shelf, the lid askew, and moved toward the opposite corner of the room, feigning casual curiosity as the door opened. Alejandro filled the doorway. He was still wearing his dark coat from earlier, droplets of rain sliding off the fabric, but his eyes swept the room like searchlights. The butler straightened, his tone instantly polite. "Senor Ferrer, I was just informing our guest that this room is not part of the tour." Alejandro's gaze landed on Valeria. "What are you doing here?" She forced her breathing to slow. "I got lost. The hallways all looked the same." His expression didn't change, but something in his stance shifted, his shoulders squaring, his head tilting slightly, like a predator circling prey. "Lost," he repeated. "Yes," she said, keeping her tone even. "I thought this might lead back to the East Wing. I was wrong." A long pause. Alejandro stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him. The butler moved aside, his face unreadable. Alejandro's eyes flicked toward the shelves, scanning the neat rows of boxes. "You have a key to this room?" he asked. "No," she lied. His gaze returned to her. "Then how did you get in?" She hesitated just long enough for him to notice. The door was open. The butler didn't look at her, but she could feel his silent warning pulsing in the air. Alejandro moved closer, stopping only a foot away. Up close, his presence was suffocating, the scent of rain and cedarwood mixing with something sharper, more dangerous. His eyes dropped briefly to her chest, and for a horrifying second she thought he might see the faint outline of the photograph beneath the fabric. But instead, he looked back at her face. "You should be careful," he said softly. "In this house, curiosity is more dangerous than disobedience." She met his gaze, forcing herself not to look away. "And what's more dangerous than curiosity?" His mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Finding the answers." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Then he turned to the butler. "See her back to her room." The butler nodded once, stepping toward her. Valeria followed him into the hallway, the photograph like a secret heartbeat against her skin. She could feel Alejandro's eyes on her back until the door shut behind them. The walk back to the East Wing was silent, but as they reached her door, the butler paused. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Whatever you think you know about your mother," he said, "you should be prepared to find out the rest may destroy you." Before she could respond, he opened the door, ushered her inside, and closed it behind her. She leaned against it, her mind spinning. The photograph was damp from her skin, but the image of her mother's face remained sharp, younger, dressed in formal clothes, standing next to a teenage Alejandro. It didn't make sense, unless she had been part of this world long before Valeria was born. She turned the photograph over. There was writing on the back, in a hand she recognized instantly, her mother's. 4 words: "Don't trust the Ferrers." A knock at her door made her jump. Dinner is ready, the butler's voice called from the other side. She slid the photograph beneath the lining of her bag, smoothed her hair, and opened the door. As she stepped into the hallway, she realized she had no idea which was more dangerous, staying in this house or leaving it without the answer she came for. The dining room was a cathedral of shadows and warm light. A chandelier dripped golden illumination over an endless table set with silver cutlery, crystal glasses, and china so delicate it seemed wrong to touch. At the far end, Alejandro sat like a monarch presiding over a court, his posture immaculate, one hand resting on a glass of deep red wine. Marcos was already there, leaning back in his chair with a casualness that felt deliberate, like he wanted everyone to know he was comfortable in this room, maybe more than Alejandro was. The butler stood behind him, silent and watchful, while two other servants moved quietly, refilling glasses and placing dishes in front of empty seats. Valeria was shown to a place halfway down the table, the distance between her and Alejandro an unspoken statement. Still, his eyes followed her as she sat, sharp as the knives lined up beside her plate. The first course arrived, a creamy soup in a porcelain bowl, but Valeria's stomach was too tight to eat. She stirred the spoon slowly, trying to ignore the tension that hummed through the room like static. Alejandro was the first to break the silence. "I trust you've settled into the East Wing," he said, his voice carrying easily across the length of the table. "Yes," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "No problems finding your way back to your room?" The question hung there, heavy with implication. She forced a faint smile. "I might have taken a wrong turn or two. Your house is big." Marcos's mouth twitched in a smirk, his eyes flicking from her to Alejandro. "She's curious. That could be a dangerous quality around here." Alejandro didn't take his gaze off Valeria. "It can also be a useful one." The air between them thickened, and even Marcos seemed to sense it. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Tell me, Valeria, do you always go poking into rooms that aren't yours?" She met his stare without flinching. "Only when someone tells me not to." Marcos chuckled, low and genuine, but Alejandro's face remained unreadable. The second course arrived, roasted meat with vegetables, the rich aroma filling the space. The clinking of silverware became the only sound for several minutes until Alejandro set down his fork and spoke again. "There's something I want to make clear," he said, his voice calm but resonant. "If you work for me, you will be loyal. To me, not to anyone else. That loyalty will be tested." Valeria swallowed a sip of water, her mind already circling the unspoken message. Marcos raised his glass slightly, his tone laced with mockery. "And if she fails the test?" Alejandro's gaze never left her. "Then she'll regret ever stepping foot in this house." A silence fell that no one seemed eager to break. The servants moved more carefully now, their eyes downcast as they cleared plates and brought the final course, a dessert of layered pastry and cream. Valeria's pulse slowed only slightly as she focused on steadying her breathing. The photograph hidden in her bag upstairs felt like it was burning through the fabric, a secret screaming to be discovered. Marcos, however, wasn't done. He set his spoon down, his voice deceptively light. "Do you know why this estate has such colorful stories attached to it?" Alejandro's eyes narrowed. "Marcos." "No, really." Marcos pressed on, his gaze fixed on Valeria. "I think she should hear it. About the night in the garden, the storm, the disappearance." The word lingered in the air like a drop of blood in water. Valeria's fingers tightened on her napkin. She said nothing, waiting for one of them to explain. Alejandro's tone dropped into something cold. "We do not discuss that night at this table." Marcos's smirk returned, but his eyes held something sharper. "Of course. Family secrets are best kept locked away. Isn't that right, Valeria?" The use of her name was deliberate. She realized then that Marcos suspected more than he was letting on. Alejandro rose from his seat, the chair scraping softly against the polished floor. "Dinner is over." The servants moved quickly to clear the table as he left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Marcos remained seated, swirling the last of his wine. "You should ask him about October 12th, '04, he murmured, his tone almost conspiratorial. "If you're brave enough." Valeria stood, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Why don't you just tell me yourself?" Marcos's smile faded. "Because I'm not the one you should be afraid of." He rose, nodding to the butler, and left her standing alone in the cavernous dining room, the sound of rain against the tall windows swallowing the silence. In that moment, Valeria knew two things. The night of October 12th, 2004, was the key to everything. And she wasn't the only one in this house who knew her mother's face. The mansion at night felt like an entirely different organism, alive, breathing in the dark, its veins the silent hallways, and its heartbeat the faint ticking of unseen clocks. The storm had thinned to a cold drizzle, but the air was still thick with the scent of rain and wet stone. Valeria lay in bed, staring at the heavy canopy above her. Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the photograph. Her mother beside a young Alejandro, the warning written in her handwriting, "Don't trust the Ferrers." It was a riddle, and every instinct in her told her the answer was out there in the garden at the gazebo. She waited until the house settled, until the sounds of servants moving in distant rooms faded, until the last creak of the wooden floorboards above her stopped. Then she rose, pulling on her coat and sliding the tarnished key into her pocket. The hallway outside was empty. She moved quickly, barefoot to muffle her steps, down the back staircase and toward the side door she'd used earlier. The cold hit her instantly when she stepped outside, a shiver racing down her spine. The lawn was slick, the grass bending under her weight as she made her way toward the white silhouette in the distance. The gazebo stood like a ghost against the night, its peeling paint pale in the moonlight. The air here was colder, heavier, as if the garden itself remembered things the house preferred to forget. She climbed the steps, crouching where she'd found the hidden compartment before. The loose board lifted with the same reluctant creak. She shone her small flashlight inside, sweeping the beam over the dark hollow. Empty. Her stomach dropped. Someone had taken whatever else was here after she'd left earlier. She lowered the board again, her mind racing, scanning the gazebo for anything she might have missed. That's when she noticed it. In the center of the floor, beneath the rotting wooden planks, a faint outline of a trapdoor. Barely visible, but there. She knelt, tracing the edges with her fingertips. It was locked, but the latch was small, rusted. She pulled out the tarnished key, her breath catching. It slid in perfectly. The lock gave with a groan, the sound carrying too loudly in the night air. She glanced over her shoulder. The mansion's windows were dark. She lifted the hatch slowly, the smell of earth and something faintly metallic rising to meet her. A narrow set of steps led down into darkness. Her flashlight beam trembled as she descended, the damp air clinging to her skin. At the bottom was a small stone chamber, maybe 10 feet across, the walls slick with moisture. In the center sat an old wooden chest, the iron hinges mottled with rust. She knelt beside it, brushing away years of dust from the lid. The lock was broken. Someone had forced it open before. Her fingers lifted the heavy lid, revealing what lay inside. Bundles of old photographs, a handful of jewelry pieces tangled in tarnished chains, and a stack of letters tied with a black ribbon. She reached for the letters first, untying the ribbon with careful fingers. The paper inside was brittle, the ink faded, but the signature at the bottom of the first page froze her blood. Her mother's name. She skimmed the lines, her breath coming faster. The letters spoke of meetings in secret, of warnings about Alejandro's father, of a night when everything would change. The last letter ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if it had been written in a hurry and never finished. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. She spun around, the beam of her flashlight slicing through the shadows. At the top of the stone steps, a figure stood, tall, still, blocking the moonlight. It wasn't Alejandro. It wasn't Marcos. It was a woman. Her face was half in shadow, but her voice carried easily into the chamber. "You shouldn't be here." Valeria's pulse thundered. "Who are you?" The woman descended slowly, her steps deliberate. "Someone who knows exactly why your mother told you not to trust the Ferrers." The beam of light caught her face fully now, sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that seemed to weigh every part of Valeria. And even in the dim light, Valeria saw it, the faint resemblance. "You," Valeria whispered. "Your family." The woman smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. And that's exactly why you should be afraid of me." The woman stopped just a few feet away, her presence filling the cramped underground chamber. Valeria's flashlight shook in her hand, the beam skimming over the stone walls and the open chest before settling back on the stranger's face. Up close, the resemblance was even more unsettling. The same shape of jaw as her mother, the same arch to the brow. It wasn't just a vague similarity, it was blood. "Who are you?" Valeria demanded, her voice low but tight. "My name doesn't matter right now," the woman replied, her tone controlled but with an undercurrent of urgency. "What matters is that you understand what really happened here on October 12th, 2004, and why your mother risked everything to leave this place." Valeria's grip tightened on the bundle of letters. "Then tell me." The woman's eyes flicked to the chest, then back to Valeria. That night, the Ferrer family held a celebration, an engagement party for Alejandro's father and a woman who, let's just say, didn't make it to the altar. It was supposed to be private, but your mother, she was there. She wasn't invited. Valeria's pulse quickened. Why would she? She came because she knew something, the woman cut in. Something about the Ferrers' business dealings. She thought she could stop what was coming, but she underestimated just how far they'd go to protect themselves. Valeria's mind flashed to the date carved into the gazebo, to the photograph of her mother beside a young Alejandro. What happened to her? The woman's jaw clenched. She disappeared before dawn. No police investigation worth mentioning. No body found. The Ferrers called it a tragic accident, said she wandered off in the storm and drowned. But people in this house know better. Some say she was last seen walking into the gazebo with Alejandro's father. Some say she never left the garden. Valeria's throat fell dry. "And you? How do you know all this?" The woman hesitated, then took a step closer. "Because I was there, and because I'm your mother's sister." The words landed like a punch. Valeria's flashlight slipped slightly in her hand. "You're my aunt." "Yes, and I've been waiting for someone to come back for what she left behind." The woman's gaze dropped to the letters in Valeria's hands. "Those are dangerous. If Alejandro sees them, he'll destroy them. If Marcos sees them, he'll use them for his own leverage. You need to give them to me." Valeria stepped back. "Why should I trust you?" "Because if you don't, you'll end up like her." The woman's voice hardened. "And because someone else is already looking for you. You've been watched since the moment you set foot on the estate." A faint sound filtered into the chamber, the creak of the gazebo floor above them. The woman's eyes snapped upward, her hand motioning for Valeria to be silent. They both stood frozen, listening. Another step, heavier this time. Whoever was up there wasn't trying to hide. Valeria's heart pounded. "Who is it?" she whispered. The woman shook her head, mouthing one word: Alejandro. A beam of light suddenly cut through the crack in the trapdoor, sweeping across the stone floor. The woman moved fast, grabbing Valeria's wrist and pulling her toward the back of the chamber. "There's another way out," she hissed. They slipped into a narrow tunnel that curved sharply, the walls damp and close. The air was thick with the scent of earth and age. Behind them, the trapdoor groaned open and Alejandro's voice echoed into the chamber, low and sharp. "Valeria." She didn't stop. The woman's grip was strong, urgent, leading her through turns that felt like a maze until they emerged behind a row of overgrown hedges at the far edge of the garden. The rain was falling harder again, masking their footsteps as they crouched low and moved toward the shadowed edge of the property. When they were far enough from the gazebo, the woman finally let go of her wrist. "You need to decide right now," she said. "Give me the letters, and I can protect you. Keep them, and you'll have every enemy in this house on your back before morning." Valeria's chest heaved, her thoughts colliding in the dark. She looked at the letters, fragile, damp, yet holding truths that had survived nearly 2 decades. But before she could answer, a voice came from the shadows ahead. It wasn't Alejandro. It was Marcos, and he was smiling. Marcos stepped out from the shadows like he'd been waiting for this moment all night. The rain clung to his hair and suit, but he looked entirely unbothered, his smirk fixed in place as his eyes flicked between Valeria and the woman beside her. "Well," he said, voice low and smooth, "isn't this touching? A midnight family reunion in the garden. Almost makes me believe in fate." Valeria's aunt shifted subtly, angling herself between Marcos and her niece. "You've been following us." "Of course I have," Marcos replied. "Do you really think anyone moves through this estate without me knowing? Especially you." His gaze landed on Valeria. "And especially you." Valeria's pulse spiked. "What do you want?" "The same thing everyone here wants," he said, taking a slow step closer. "The truth. But unlike Alejandro, I don't want to bury it. I want to use it." Her aunt's tone was sharp. "You mean weaponize it?" Marcos's smile didn't falter. "Let's not pretend this isn't a game of leverage. Those letters you're clutching like a lifeline? They're the only real power in this place. They tell the story Alejandro's father tried to erase. They explain what happened on October 12th, and they name the people who were there when your mother disappeared." Valeria's stomach twisted. "Why should I believe you?" Marcos's eyes softened, but it was the kind of softness that could cut deeper than cruelty. "Because whether you believe me or not, you're already in the middle of this. You can hand those letters to her." He tilted his chin toward her aunt. "And watch Alejandro hunt you both. You can give them to Alejandro and watch him destroy them. Or," he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you can give them to me, and I can promise you'll have protection and answers." Her aunt turned sharply toward Valeria. "He'll feed you what benefits him and hide the rest. Don't you see? He's just as dangerous as the Ferrers. Those letters are your only bargaining chip. If you hand them over, you lose every bit of control you have." The rain drummed harder against the leaves overhead, the cold seeping through Valeria's coat. Both of them were watching her now, waiting. The weight of the letters in her hands felt heavier than any decision she'd ever made. She looked at Marcos. "If I give them to you, you'll tell me what happened to my mother?" A shadow crossed his expression, something almost genuine. "I'll tell you everything, and I'll make sure Alejandro never touches you." Her aunt's voice cut in, urgent. "Valeria, listen to me." But she didn't get to finish. From somewhere behind them, Alejandro's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Valeria, step away from him." They turned to see him standing under the weak glow of a garden lantern, his coat soaked, his eyes dark and fixed on her. "Give me the letters," he said. The world seemed to narrow to the three of them: rain, shadows, and the fragile papers in her trembling hands. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow. No matter what she chose, someone would become her enemy. Slowly, she looked from Marcos to Alejandro, then to her aunt. And she made her choice. Her fingers loosened. The letters left her hand. The storm roared louder, swallowing the gasp that followed. And in that instant, Valeria knew she had just bound herself to a side in a war that had been raging long before she was born. But whether she had chosen the right one, she might not live long enough to find out. Sometimes, the truth we uncover doesn't set us free. It chains us to a destiny we never asked for. Valeria thought she was searching for a job, but God had other plans. Plans that would test her courage, her loyalty, and her faith in ways she could never imagine. Because when secrets this dark come to light, it's not just about survival. It's about who you choose to be when no one is watching. And you, if you were in her place, to whom would you have given the letters? Tell me in the comments from which city you're watching this, because I want to know how far this story has reached. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next story that will make your heart race and your mind question everything. Sometimes, God puts the right story in front of you at the right time. Maybe this is yours.